Every time I think the word Slav, of course the word Slav comes from that word we get the word slaves. From the Roman times, the Slavs were looked down on as being primitive. And Romans would often go in and collect Slavic people and enslave them. And the Slavic people would get bamboo shoots and hide themselves underwater and breathe through the bamboo shoots to try to avoid being captured. But sometimes they learned that, hey, if you see a bamboo shoot that's leaning a little bit off from the rest of them, there's probably a Slav on the other end of it. And especially if you see a bamboo shoot that's not coming to a point, but it's cut off the top, then probably a Slav is in the water on the other end of the shoot. So they learned to fish, you might say, fish the poor Slavic people out. Adolf Hitler especially looked down on the Slavs and said they were inferior and needed to be eliminated. No, I do not in any way condone that, but the Slavic people seem to have had, as an ethnic group, a tendency to not be able to form themselves into a strong and powerful state and not to follow any king. Anyway, the Slavic people came from what is today Russia and spread out into the areas of, now, they spread into Poland and even into what is today the Czech Republic, and that's why we get the name Czechoslovakia, comes from the Czechs and the Slavs. But a bunch of them came from Russia and settled in this region here. Now this is extremely important today because this explains why that the Slavic people looked to Russia often for help, looked to Russia as their homeland. And during World War I, a Serbian, who is a Slavic person, shot the Archduke of the heir to Austria's throne, and started World War I because Serbia, when Austria started to crush little Serbia, Serbia appealed to Russia for aid, and Russia came running. Well, folk, fast forward to 2014, and to this day, Russia is still saying, we'll protect our interest in this region. And this has caused a lot of problems because the Muslims moved in, the Eastern Orthodox moved in, but this area is close to where the Roman Catholic Church has its headquarters, so this has led to a lot of conflict. And this area has been known as a tinderbox of Europe, like the fuse that will light up all of Europe. This was especially true during World War I, but they have also caused other wars and could lead to war even to this day. President Clinton sent American troops into this region to keep down uprisings. So, but again, these people have roots in Russia, and they tend to be Eastern Orthodox Catholic, as the Russians are. So, in your books, I'm looking at the map on page 435 where it shows the route that the Slavic people took getting into the Balkan region. Which takes me up to the Russians. Initially, the capital of Russia was not in Moscow, but it was in Kiev. The first Russian king that, let's see. The word Russia comes from the word Rus, for these were Viking people who came down from Norway and Sweden and settled in this region and took over. And they were under the leadership of Rurik. And from that day until the day the last Russian Tsar died, all your Russian monarchs claim to be descended from Rurik. The legendary, I won't write that name down, but the one name I do want you to remember is the name of Oleg. Oh yeah, okay. Oleg was one of the first leaders. Oleg was the one who took over Kiev and established the capital Kiev. Then came Vladimir. Now, Vladimir began to realize that the old Viking religion was somewhat outdated and he wanted to switch religions, so he looked at four main religions that he came across in this area. First he looked at Judaism, then at Islam, then at Roman Catholicism, and finally Eastern Orthodoxy. The Eastern Orthodox Church had by this time split from Rome. Well, he finally said that the Jews are too, this is his view, not mine. Any God who could not keep his people in their homeland was not strong enough for him, so the Jews were just too weak and too feeble, so he rejected Judaism. He then went to Islam, but they've had a big problem with Islam. Islam, he said, does not allow me to drink, and anybody who knows anything at all about the Russians and folk, the Russians drink a lot. I mean, I'm stating a fact. I mean, I don't mean to be running them down, but they drink all constantly. All right. Well, okay. Well, no, he couldn't live with that. No, that's that. He also, Islam forbade gambling, and well, that was out. He then went to Rome, but the problem here with Rome, he said that Roman Catholics have to have loyalty to the Pope, and I'm not going to get involved in the fights that they're having with the Pope, between Pope and Emperor. So, who are we on that? But then he went into an Eastern Orthodox church. He said it was like entering into another world. He got into this Eastern Orthodox church. There was stained glass, and the stained glass had Bible stories throughout the stained. Any of you who've been in an Eastern Orthodox church might know some of what I'm talking about. And then the choir said it was like I entered another world. It's like I entered heaven's realms when the choir sang. And he said, this is religion for me. And from that day until 1917, Eastern Orthodoxy became the official religion of Russia. Now I'm going to be talking more about Eastern Orthodoxy in a little bit. I've done some research on it, and I had a friend at Lockheed who converted from Pentecostalism to Eastern Orthodoxy, and he wound up late in his life regretting it. He's deceased now, but he said, if I'd have known what I know now, I'd never done it. But he went to an Eastern Orthodox church and was just simply, just carried away by what he saw there. I will say this, folks. A big problem I have with the Eastern Orthodox, and again, I don't know the religious convictions of any of you, but this is a fact. Everywhere that Eastern Orthodox have been, if the Muslims have not taken over, the communists have. And now you've got to ask yourself, now why is that? I think I have something of an answer, but they did not have the unity and the cohesion if you can find in the rest of Europe. They were more divided and more unstable, and they simply could not join and fight against it. Now, some people said, oh, it's because the Eastern Orthodox world was closer to the Muslim world. Well, then how do you explain how come communism took over an Eastern Orthodox country, and communism took over a lot of this part of the world, which was Eastern Orthodox also? Again, everywhere they've been, the man at Lockheed said, yeah, that bothers me too. It should, because it bothers me. But anyway, leaving that for the moment. After Vladimir, eventually Genghis Khan came in and he conquered Russia. The Mongolians were to hold Russia for 200 years. Now, during that time, a detachment of the royal family from Kiev took over the region of Muscovy, which we know of as Moscow. I'll put down Moscow instead of Muscovy. Now, the Dukes of Moscow had some really, really good fortune you rarely find in history. They went 200 years and only had 5 dukes. Every one of these dukes lived to be an old man, and when he died, he turned the throne over to a middle-aged son, who in turn lived to be an old man, and they only had 5 over 200 years. They had mature men, and they were all oldest sons. And again, this is rare. And during that time, Moscow became more respected. I mean, they had a stable government. They had wise, capable rulers. Now, when I say wise, capable rulers, hopefully all of you know, in the United States Constitution, there's a clause that has never been questioned, never been amended. It says that the President of the United States and the Vice President must be at least 32 years of age. No, 35, pardon me, 30, senators are 32. The President must be 35 years old. And again, I know I'm talking to a classroom where most of you are probably younger than that. Believe me, you're going to get there plenty soon enough. But we just simply think that a 35-year-old person, whether it be male or female, is wiser than someone who's not 35. Well, in the case of Moscow, they had when the old king would finally die, he would turn the throne over to a middle-aged, wise, capable man. And Moscow then became the center of Russian political life. And it was Moscow then who got together an army found strong enough to drive the Mongolians out. So Moscow became the capital of Russia and has remained so to this day. Again, the book goes into a little bit more detail, talking about how the Russians fought the Germans for a while, but I'll leave that out. But what I do remember was that eventually, after 200 years, the Russians were able to drive out the Mongolians. But it has been said, and it's a common saying, scratch a Russian, and underneath that Russian you'll find a Mongolian. That the Russians still have a little bit of Mongolian. Now, a problem that Russia was located between the east and west, and they could never decide, is our orientation toward the east or is it toward the west? Peter the Great tried to tell them, hey, look to the west is the brighter part, but sometimes they found the east to be more spiritual or more to their liking, but eventually they wound up looking to the west. Now another issue they had, and this was something that's been going on since the days of Peter the Great, if not before, they have always felt like they're behind the rest of the world and always trying to catch up. You ever see a basketball team that's behind the whole game but trying to play what's called catch-up ball, or a football team even trying to play catch-up ball? They've always felt like they're behind. Behind whom? Behind Germany, behind Great Britain, behind France, and behind the United States, trying to catch up somehow. This part of the world is making big, big news. And in fact, this morning I saw an article on MSN, which I did not take time to read, that the Ukrainian airport is on fire. Well, hey, I guess the first thing I think of is who might have said it. And when the class is over, will Ukraine be at war? Again, they've been a hot spot all my life. All right, moving on, Christianity in medieval world. The church came into conflict with secular authorities. Your book talks about a phenomenon called lay investiture. In other words, who was to appoint church officials? Well, a lot of times nobility would appoint church officials, and the church said, no, we should. And this led to conflict. Now, eventually, they got together and hammered out their differences in a meeting called the Diet of Worms. It looks like sometimes that's pronounced worms, or kind of the Concordat of Worms. All right. Your book says that can be pronounced worms. I've heard it pronounced worms. Your book gives both pronunciations. But in this concordant, they agreed that the church would appoint its own officials. And folk, you might think, what is the big deal? The big deal is this became like the only part of the world where the church appointed its own officials. Western Europe. Over here, church officials were appointed by the Tsar. Over here in this part of the world, officials were appointed by the Caliph. What this led to, folk, and if the Catholic Church didn't do anything else right, they did one thing right. When the smoke had cleared, they were at least independent of the state. You have what's called separation of church and state. The Catholic Church was able to make sure that it was in charge of at least appointing its own officials. And when the Protestant movement came along later, the Protestants began to appoint their own officials. And every church in the United States, the officials are not appointed by act of Congress, not appointed by the president. All church officials are appointed by each body, each denomination, according to their own church's constitution. Again, folk, this may not seem important to you, but when Hitler took over Germany, he began appointing a church official, and even some atheists said, hey, this is wrong. Somehow, even to atheists, this seemed to be wrong, that the church should be, like it had been for hundreds of years, separate and independent of the state. Otherwise, the church becomes a tool of the state. And the result is the church does not in any way put a check on the state. I mean, folks, it was so bad that when the communists took over Russia in 1917, during the entire 70 years the communists ruled Russia, the Eastern Orthodox Church never protested one action by the communist government. One time.